As we continue our study through Matthew, we have been in chapter 5 for quite a while as we look at the Sermon on the Mount. It's important that, as I prayed, that we remember something that I think is crucial to understanding the Word, understanding this text, and that is, this is Jesus' sermon. The one who died for us, the one who suffered everything for our sake, is on a hill in Galilee somewhere with people gathered around him, and he is teaching from his heart. He is teaching about the kingdom, what it truly means to be a citizen of heaven. And not only is he speaking to those people, those Israelites, those Jews on that hill in Galilee all those years ago, but God intended to send him, and his word was written. It was documented so that the church today can hear from Jesus, as if we were on the side of that hill with him. It is so important as preachers that when we enter a text that's as important and powerful as this one, the words of Jesus, that we are bringing to you the intent, the meaning, and that we as Christians are truly searching our heart to say, what does this have to do with me? How is God pointing out my sin? How is God drawing me closer to him? What is Jesus telling me? And so to get our context and to wrap our minds around this, we'll start reading, and I'll begin from verse 17, chapter 5, verse 17, and read through verse 42 as we look at this text today. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard it that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. This is the word of the Lord. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus says, do not resist the one who is evil. If you remember long ago when we were in the Beatitudes, really this is an application to what Jesus proclaims about those who belong to the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 5 through 7, he says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. What Jesus is now showing, he's not giving different sermons, he is now applying everything he has proclaimed. He has taken their view of the kingdom and who the people of God are and who really belongs to the kingdom, and he has turned it upside down. Or at least turned their perspective upside down so they could see right side up the way God sees it. Jesus knew that for the people sitting on that hillside and for all of us who are listening to this sermon, for us to embrace the truth about the kingdom, he must first turn this paradigm upside down so that they can see the kingdom from God's perspective. And this is where you get this series of antitheses. You have heard it said. This is what the law says, but this is what I say. He's not contradicting the law, he is correcting their understanding of it. And as we look at these verses 38 through 42, which are so important for us to know today, in these times of peril and anger and injustice, how do people of the kingdom respond to racial discrimination? How do people of the kingdom respond to injustice that's going on in the world? How people are oppressed by a government and wars are breaking out all over the globe. How do those people in that context who belong to Jesus respond as citizens of the kingdom? And what we want to come away with today is an understanding that responding to injustice with meekness and patience and mercy, it displays the authenticity of your faith, and it affirms your identity as a follower of Jesus. Responding to injustice with meekness and patience displays the authenticity of your faith and affirms your identity as a follower of Jesus. I tell you, this is impossible. When faced with injustice, both personally and when you look around the globe, to respond in meekness and mercy, to respond with a heart like Jesus, it takes something we don't have. And this is Jesus' point. This is the point that he is making. Now we have to understand something. We've been talking about the law. God gave Moses the law. And he gave the law to Moses at a particular time for a particular people to be the foundation on which God would mold and shape a wicked and defiant nation according to his will. I want you to hear what I'm saying here. The law was the foundation and not the ultimate standard of God's righteousness. It was the foundation and not the ultimate standard of God's righteousness. This is why Jesus came and he said, I have come to fulfill the law. Because the ultimate standard is Christ, and the way Christ lives, and the way Christ obeys the Father, and the way Christ lives out love and mercy. What he's doing in us is he's making us into the likeness of him. He is the ultimate standard. The law was perfectly created and suited for its purpose. The problem was it was reinterpreted and misapplied. And when you take truth and you misinterpret it, you misapply it, what you create is a false standard to live by. Israel was led away from God. They were led away from the direction, from the foundation that he laid in order to lead them to righteousness. They were led away by mishandling God's law. The law was a good tool used in a bad way. You know, more than once I've gone out to my garden and I have found my tools, mostly my hammer, laying in the yard, covered in dirt with holes everywhere in my yard. My sons love to dig. The problem is the hammer is not supposed to be a digging tool. You should never get dirt on your hammer if it's used correctly. And yet my sons love to use it to dig holes, and they do more damage than good. Frankly, I don't want to give them a shovel either. But this is exactly, as a way of an illustration, what God's people, Israel, was doing with the law. They were using a good tool in a bad way. The problem is it's worse than that. It was like using an axe to perform open heart surgery. We have to understand the law in its context, who it was given to. For 400 years, Israel was enslaved by a wicked pagan society who treated them brutally. They were slaves. And as a result, they really grew into be a brutal and wicked society. They were pagans. They were godless, lawless. They were unloved, mistreated. This is the lot that Moses was given when he said, "Lead my people out of Israel." This is who he led out. This barbaric, vengeful society, they needed just basic guidelines for living together and living with God. The laws and commandments given to Moses were meant to suppress sin, suppress criminals, and they were meant to defend the weak. The purpose of the law was to create this basic law and order for a corrupt and barbaric society. The amazing thing is, as basic and foundational as they were unable to keep them. And to this day, man is unable to keep the law of God. And now you begin to see the weight of what Jesus is saying when he says, unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That was what the law was supposed to do, was supposed to reveal that what you need to enter the kingdom is something you can't produce on your own, namely the righteousness of God. The law only exposed the reality that the root problem cannot be solved by the law itself. The law just reveals the sin, because the root problem lies in the heart of man, and this is what Jesus is speaking to on that hillside in Galilee. He wants to get to the heart, because therein lies the root of the problem. The goal of Christ's message is to reveal to a self-righteous, sinful society that they are lawbreakers and that they do not have the righteousness needed to enter the kingdom of heaven. What God introduces to Moses in the law is he introduces both God's justice and God's mercy. Now, even in our society today, and in much of the world, there are laws. And in the Western world, we understand laws basically to be a set of rules, a set of regulations that are made and enforced by the government in order to regulate society, to regulate the conduct of people that live in that society. In order for the society to remain civil, in order for the society to remain orderly, there needs to be an understanding that the rules, the law, must be upheld. And when broken, there must be a proper consequence for the law that was broken. The consequence for breaking the law must be delivered to ensure the safety and the civility of that society. And this is what the law of retribution was meant for. This is what Jesus is referencing. we have this concept in our law today. We call it lex talionis. Basically, the punishment needs to fit the crime. This is what God has established. This is what he did establish through Moses for this barbaric, rebellious people, Israel. The law was there to ensure really two things: that people would not take the law into their own hands, and secondly, to protect people from falling into this never-ending cycle of bloodthirsty revenge. 3 times in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, this law of lex talionis, the punishment being connected to the crime, the right punishment for the crime. 3 times in Exodus chapter 21, but if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. In Leviticus chapter 24, if anyone injures his neighbor as he has done it, shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given, a person shall be given. The thing that needs to be remembered is God gave this to Moses not for the people to execute themselves, but for the leadership in Israel to execute the punishment, to remove the retaliation from the hands of the person who was offended or hurt and given over to a governing authority. In Israel's case, it was God as the ultimate authority being exercised through the judges and the priests. Deuteronomy chapter 19, the judges shall inquire diligently. And then it says, your eye shall not pity. It's not to be emotional. The law is the law. You should hand it over. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And again, what makes Israel so unique is that these rules, these regulations, the law, they were made and handed down to the people by God himself. They were both a nation and a people of God. The law was established to help them live in peace with God and with one another. It's important to know, though, this, again, is the foundation from which God is working to conform a people according to his will. The law that's laid here presupposes, it assumes the existence of sin. Consequences, law that's established today, this lex talionis, it's put down there to assume that people will break the law, and therefore there must be a punishment. But the reason why that sin is assumed is because of the hardness of their heart. The law was given because of the hardness of Israel's heart. God needed to establish a basic law of retribution, carried out in a good and righteous way. What Jesus is leading the people on the hill to understand is the same thing he was teaching about divorce. It's not, if you divorce, do it this way. It's, you shouldn't be getting divorced at all. It's not, seek out retribution. You should not be seeking out revenge at all. But because of the hardness of heart, God establishes a law to reveal man's sin, but to give authority to governments to judge and to govern and rule according to God's standard. And so as it go, and as we see in the courts today, when someone is harmed or sinned against, the guilty party was brought before the priests and the judge. The priests and the judge represented God and his law. And they executed justice according to the will of God, not to the will of the people. It was a foundational law, which showed them that they could not take the law into their own hands, but they needed to hand over to God and to trust the judgment of God. The problem in Jesus' day is that the Jews had taken this law and they have misinterpreted it as God's permission to take vengeance. And they said, according to the law, I have the right. I have the right to retaliate. I have the right to take vengeance. And yet we know that was never God's intent. He simply wanted to protect them from their own hearts, from their excessive vengeance, to curb these wicked vendettas. So Jesus contradicts their teaching and he says, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. Now we have to understand something to understand what Jesus is saying in the right context. He is in no way eradicating the responsibility of a government or a nation to exercise justice. He is showing how citizens of the kingdom are called to respond when they are treated unjustly. How are you supposed to respond? How is God calling you to respond when someone acts wickedly against you? And Jesus says, do not resist. This is a hard saying. It's not what our hearts want to do. We are by nature self-defensive. But Jesus says, do not resist. And what does that mean? What does it mean, do not resist? What Jesus is saying, well, first of all, he is not saying that we should lay down. Just take it when someone sins against you. Say nothing. Pretend like it didn't happen. Sweep it under the rug. Ignore it. The Bible never says to ignore sin. In fact, the whole sermon Jesus is preaching is based upon the precept that he's exposing their sin. We're never to pretend like sin is not happening. The Bible is all about exposing sin. It's all about outing the sinner and calling them to repentance. Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11 through 14, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Jesus is not advocating apathy towards sin. He is telling us how to respond, how our hearts are to be filled with God in such a way that how we react. And he says, do not resist. And what this means is, do not respond in kind. When they treat you with anger, don't respond with anger. When they treat you with malice or try to shame you, you don't try to shame them. When they fight, you don't fight back. Do not respond to aggression with more aggression. We are called to patiently endure the aggression that is against us. Why? Because it demonstrates that you have entrusted yourself to a good and faithful God. Repay no one evil for evil, Paul says in Romans 12. But give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. You have to remember that God is a sovereign and a just God. He doesn't respond the way we hope to in the time he hopes to, but trust me, he knows every sin that is being committed. And the sin is not against you ultimately. The sin that is happening to you is ultimately against God, and it is God's right, God's authority to judge, God's authority to seek vengeance, and not ours. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst not for bloodthirsty revenge, but who hunger and thirst for righteousness. These are the citizens of the kingdom. Proverbs chapter 20, which is so important to remember, Jesus isn't giving something new. It was God's intent to establish justice because of the wicked heart of man, but he was calling his people to live above that and to live in a fulfilled calling, a fulfilled standard of righteousness, which only Jesus can fulfill. And he's what's calling us to it. And the cross displays that Christ has done everything for us. And by faith we are drawn to him. So that not only are we set free from sin and death, but we are given the power and the righteousness to live according to his word, to live according to his ultimate standard. Proverbs 20 says, do not say, I will repay evil for evil, or I will repay evil. He says, wait for the Lord. Wait for the Lord. He will deliver you. Paul says himself, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, see that no one repays anyone evil for evil. That means people in the church and the sinful world that we live in. But always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Now, Jesus gives 4 examples of injustice as a way of illustrating or contextualizing his command of, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. And really, what the examples he gives can be broken down into 4 basic things that we all defend, especially in a Western world where we are free. We love our freedom. We love our rights. Jesus gives 4 examples that deal with our personal honor, our personal rights, my honor, my rights, my freedom, and my possessions. 4 things that we fight to defend. In the first example, he says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. Now, contextually, in the first century Palestine, one of the gravest of insults is to hit somebody with the back of your hand. This place saying, you're lower than me, you're lower than a slave. I even read somewhere that they had written that slaves would rather be whipped than hit with the back of the hand, because with the back of the hand came with great shame. Hitting someone with the back of your hand communicated that they were worthless, less than a slave. It was the ultimate act of public humiliation and shame. It was the perfect combination of insult and injury. And if we remember, in first century, Israel was occupied by Rome. And Roman soldiers, most of them didn't really care about culture. They didn't care about law, as in the law of God. They only cared about one law, and that was Rome. And they were the authority. And how grievous would it be, how horrible would it be if a Roman soldier would smack an Israelite with the back of their hand, shaming them, dishonoring them? How horrible would it be if that Israelite then in anger responded and hit that soldier back? Not only would it bring horrible consequences for him, but more than likely his whole family. And Jesus says, how do you respond in this? He says, you don't respond aggression for aggression, but you are a citizen of the kingdom. You respond in meekness and mercy to the point where you're willing to take another hit. My honor. Another example of injustice is we fight for our rights. My right. These are my rights. I don't deserve this. I have my rights. You can't do this to me. The assumption in this is that someone is stripping someone of their undergarment for what I believe is an unjust reason, because Jesus in the context is talking about this injustice. And they are unjustly taking them to court and suing them for their undergarment. And he says, if they come and they want to sue you for your undergarment, you settle and give them your outer garment. The outer garment. In fact, the outer garment, according to the law, was the inalienable right of a citizen of Israel to keep. That outer garment was not only your coat, it was your blanket at night. You couldn't just take someone's outer garment. And Jesus says, if they're going to go after you and unjustly sue you, use the courts against you, you're willing to even give them your outer garment. That's just crazy. David, I think you're maybe overstretching the interpretation here. But the point that Jesus is getting at is, what is your treasure? What is your true possession? What are your real rights? You've sacrificed, you've laid your rights down for the sake of the gospel. Your citizenship is in heaven. What are we willing to part with? What are we willing to die to? What rights are we willing to give up for the sake of possessing the kingdom, for the sake of Jesus and knowing Him? Surrender more than they're asking for. Is that what he's saying? Because all that we have, our rights, they're nothing to us compared to the treasure of knowing Christ and being a part of His kingdom. Thirdly, we fight for our freedom. It's my freedom. I'm free. You can't push me around. You can't control me. And here in the first century, a Roman soldier at any time, including Sabbath, could take an Israelite and say, I'm forcing you to carry my bag for a mile. Not only is that stealing that person's freedom, but their religion. Because the Sabbath was meant to be a day of rest, not carrying this wicked, dirty Gentile's bag. Jesus says, don't resist injustice, even to the point where you're willing to go the extra mile to demonstrate grace, to demonstrate true freedom. That your freedom isn't defined by the freedoms that you have in your own country or according to what you believe freedom is, but your freedom is according to Christ. That because of freedom, you have been set free. Christ has set you free, that we may no longer be bound by a yoke of slavery to sin. And because we are set free from sin and we belong to Jesus, these other freedoms that we have are so secondary. I hear in the news, as you watch my country just in turmoil, torn apart, that people are protesting in the streets. And they do have the right for peaceful protest to proclaim what they believe is wrong. But we're not watching the peaceful protesters. We're watching angry, violent people in the news. And unfortunately, there are too many Christians on social media approving them, so-called Christians. Well, I understand why they're angry. Yes, they're angry because they don't have the heart of God. Yes, sin causes us to be angry, but we don't respond in kind. We are called to love. We are called to peace. We are called to prayerfully entrust ourselves to a good and faithful God. Are you willing to go the extra mile? Are you willing to suffer aggression and injustice patiently, speaking the truth in love, declaring that sin is sin, exposing sin, but willing to suffer because of the greater upward call of Jesus Christ? And fourthly, he talks about my possessions. Oh, we love our stuff. Somebody asks me for something, someone wants to borrow something, Jesus says, just lend, just give and lend. When our treasure is ultimately Jesus himself, what is it that we hold on to? What are these things that we have? They're nothing. They're all going to burn away. Jesus is calling us not only to pursue peace and long-suffering, he's calling us to do it generously. He's calling us to have a generous spirit. In application or in conclusion, there's just a few things I want to say. And these are hard. Even as I was preparing the sermon this week, I struggled with the sermon because through it all I was exposed to was my own self-defensive heart. In comparison with Jesus, everything he is describing, he lived perfectly. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, he opened not his mouth. As he was brutally beaten and tortured and hung up on a cross to die for the sin of the world, and people were spitting on him and mocking him, he didn't yell back. He didn't call on God to bring down fire. He endured, and he says, Father, forgive them. And then he says, this is how you're called to live. Be like me. This is the righteousness. This is the standard for citizens of the kingdom. But I want to say something very clear. Showing grace and forgiveness does not mean shielding the law from sinners. Justice is something God has established. We have to notice in this text that Jesus is not talking about taking personal revenge on the person who did the offense. He is talking about taking personal revenge. He's saying that's the sin. He's not talking about the act itself. We can trust, at least in our society, we can entrust ourselves to the government that God has placed us in. That is not true for everyone. There are many people in the world who suffer the way the first century Israelites did, or even the government was unjust. But we are called to the same thing. But where justice can be served, we should not shield people. We are allowed to demand that the authorities do justice and handle the violators. What Jesus is dealing with is taking that personal revenge. There are bad examples of people trying to be merciful and doing the wrong thing. Unfortunately, how many stories have I heard where a pastor or a youth worker committed a sin against someone younger or weaker than them, and in the name of mercy and forgiveness, they were not handed over to the authorities. You don't get to shield people from the consequences of their sin. God has given you the authority. You should hand those people over the authority and let justice be done, but you seek forgiveness. You don't have to hold that bitterness in your heart. You don't have to seek that revenge. You can give it over to a God, a holy, loving God. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. We don't want to swing so far to mercy that we dismiss that God has given us justice, and it's for us to hand over to Him, over to the authorities, over to the judge. There are consequences for sin. And when the sin is also breaking the law, we as Christians, we are not called to shield people from the consequences of their sin. But we are called to peace, love, forgiveness, grace, long-suffering. Secondly, I want to say that this message really hits home for me, and I think many of us in the church, and how often we're really no different than the Pharisees in Jesus' day, who were using the Bible in a bad way to justify our self-defensive, bitter, angry, vengeful hearts. No, you would never physically hurt that person who said that thing about you or did that thing to you, but you're going to give them the cold shoulder. You're going to ignore them. You're willing to gossip about them. In your self-defense, you've put up these walls to shield yourself from being hurt. And you say to yourself, I didn't deserve this. I deserve better than that. They had no right to do that to me. But if we compare this to what Jesus is saying, your self-defensive heart has painted you the victim of their wickedness. But in the process of building up walls, you have built yourself into a prison where you suffer the pain, the tyranny of your own pride. One of the Lord's saints who's lived on this earth, and died many years ago was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German born in Breslau in 1906. He grew to be one of the greatest theologians of his time. He was a pastor. He was a theologian. He studied both here in Germany, but also the United States. And even when he could stay in America and be safe from the persecution of the Nazis, he chose to go back to his home country, where he would continue to publicly denounce the Nazi regime. This ultimately led to his arrest in 1943, and he was hanged as a conspirator in 1945. One of the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer was The Cost of Discipleship, which is dealing with this passage. No one understood injustice more than Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But in the 20th century, no one understood greater what it meant to be a citizen of the kingdom of God than Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, talking about this text, he wrote something that was so powerful, so transforming for me, that I feel like me describing it wouldn't do justice, and I just want to read it to you. And I want these words to wash over you. A man of God expressing his heart, his understanding of what it means to live in meekness and mercy, to live as a citizen of the kingdom in the context of a sinful, wicked, unjust world. And this is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said. This is what he wrote. The only way to overcome evil is to let it run itself to a standstill, because it does not find the resistance it is looking for. Resistance merely creates further evil and adds fuel to the flames. But when evil meets no opposition, it encounters no obstacle, but only patient endurance. Its sting is drawn, and at last it meets an opponent which is more than its match. Of course, this can only happen when the last ounce of resistance is abandoned and the renunciation of revenge is complete. Then evil cannot find its mark. It can breed no further evil, and it is left barren. By willing endurance, we cause suffering to pass. Evil becomes a spent force when we put up no resistance. Violence stands condemned by its failure to evoke counter-violence. When a man unjustly demands that I should give him my coat, I offer him my cloak also. And so I counter his demand. When he requires me to go the mile, I will go willingly and show up his exploitation of my service for what it is. To leave everything behind at the call of Christ is to be content with Him alone and to follow only Him. By his willing, renouncing self-defense, the Christian affirms his absolute adherence to Jesus and his freedom from the tyranny of his own ego. The exclusiveness of this adherence is the only power which can overcome evil. As I close this time together, I would like to put up 4 questions for your reflection. Those of you at home, you can take a screenshot or write these down to talk amongst each other, to pray through. Because this idea of having this self-defensive heart, being set free from the tyranny of our pride and our ego, to experience the fullness of what it is to be in Christ. This is what God wants to show us this morning. So we're going to leave these questions up for just a little bit, to ponder on them, to think about them, and I pray to fellowship together in response to what God is teaching us from His Word.